Don't move. Keep those hands where I can see them.
Hands are up, sir. I have done nothing wrong.
I'll decide that.
My identification is inside my car. I need to reach into the
Always got
vehicle
something to say.
I am asking you to
Don't
let me
reach
show
for
you who
anything.
I am.
Keep your hands where I can see them. The command cut across the lot before Clement Ashwell had done anything wrong. His hands were already raised, both of them, palms forward, at shoulder height. He had not been asked. He had raised them the moment the cruiser's lights hit his back, because he understood the way some men understand certain things without being taught, that in this kind of encounter, the first thing you do is make your hands impossible to misread. Sheriff Jonathan Corsi stood 10 feet away. His right hand rested on his weapon. His eyes had found the holster on Clement's hip and had not moved since. Clement stated that he was reaching for his identification. His wallet was in his left breast pocket. He had not moved toward it. He was telling Corsi where it was and asking how to proceed. Corsi told him not to reach. Clement said he needed to reach to produce the identification. Corsi said he had not given permission to reach. The commands were contradictory. Clement registered this without expression. He had been in situations before where the instructions given and the outcome desired were two different things, and where the gap between them was the real danger. He kept his hands where they were. Then, beneath a shout, clipped and deliberate, Corsi said that people like Clement always had a reason, always had an excuse. Clement asked him to repeat that. Something crossed Corsi's face, a half-second of awareness, then it was gone, replaced by something harder. He told Clement to get on the ground. Clement stated, one more time, that he was reaching for his military identification. The shot went through his left shoulder. He went down beside pump 3. His wallet had not moved. If you are ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let me know if you enjoyed the story. Let's continue. It was 10:53 on a Wednesday night when Clement Ashwell turned off Route 9 and pulled into the Sunoco. His tank was low. His phone was at 11%. He had been on the road for just over 2 hours, Fort Drum behind him, and home still 50 miles ahead. The Sunoco lot was quiet. The canopy overhead threw white light down onto the concrete and turned everything beyond its edges dark. Clement pulled to pump 3, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Not because anything was wrong, because after 2 hours of highway, the body needs a second before it agrees to move again. He was 36 years old. He had completed 2 overseas deployments, led a 12-man unit in conditions where composure was not a virtue, but a survival requirement, and returned home with a record his commanding officer had once summarized in a single line, the kind of officer you want beside you when the situation is unclear. He was stationed at Fort Drum and had been for 3 years, driving home when he could, which was less often than Adrian would have liked and more often than the calendar usually permitted. His sidearm sat in a hip holster. Military issue, legally carried, worn openly as regulations required for active personnel in transit. He had checked it at the start of the drive the same way he checked the mirrors and the fuel gauge once, methodically and without ceremony. It was part of the equipment. Nothing more. Clement got out of the vehicle. The night air was cooler than it had been during the day. He swiped his card at the pump, entered his PIN, and waited for the machine to authorize. Inside the station, through the glass, a night attendant named Vickers was restocking a refrigerated shelf. He was in his late 20s, on the back half of a 10-hour shift, a half-finished energy drink on the counter beside the register. He glanced through the glass when Clement's car pulled in. A man at the pump, unremarkable, going about his business. Vickers went back to the shelf. The pump began. Clement stood beside the vehicle, phone in hand, watching the battery percentage with the mild resignation of someone who had let it get too low again. He was not in a hurry. Home was 50 miles. The tank would fill, the phone would charge in the car, and the rest of the drive was straight highway. He was not watching the road when the headlights came in. He heard the cruiser before he saw it, the particular acceleration of a vehicle that is not looking for a space to park, a vehicle entering with intent. The lights came on. Blue and red, flooding the lot, bouncing off the store windows, off the pump, off the concrete. The siren gave one short chirp authority announced, attention demanded, and went silent. The cruiser stopped behind Clement's vehicle, close enough to block the driver's door. Sheriff Jonathan Corsi stepped out. He was 52, built wide across the shoulders, and he carried himself with the settled certainty of a man who had been the highest authority in a room for a very long time. He did not approach the way a professional approaches an unknown situation, scanning, neutral, gathering information. He walked directly toward Clement with the focus of someone who had already reached a conclusion and was now proceeding to its enforcement. His eyes moved to the holster, then they stayed there. Clement turned slowly, both hands coming up without instruction. He asked, in an even voice, what the situation was. Corsi told him to step away from the vehicle. Clement said he was fueling. He asked the reason for the contact. Corsi repeated the command. Clement stepped away from the vehicle, hands still raised, voice still level. He had been in rooms with loaded weapons and uncertain men. He knew how to read the air. He asked whether he was being detained and on what basis. The question landed badly. Corsi's hand shifted to his holster. He said he was not going to ask again. Clement said he was carrying. He said the weapon was legally holstered. He said he was active military. He said his identification was in his left breast pocket and asked how Corsi wanted him to retrieve it. Corsi told him not to reach. Clement said he had to reach to produce the identification. Corsi said he had already been told. Then, at a volume just below a shout, Corsi said that people like Clement always had a reason, always had an excuse, always thought the rules did not apply. Clement's jaw set. He asked Corsi to repeat what he had said. Something moved across Corsi's face, the brief, visible awareness of a man who knows he has let something out. It lasted less than a second. Then he told Clement to reach for that weapon and see what happened. Clement said clearly that he was reaching for his identification. The shot cracked across the lot. Vickers dropped the bottle he was holding. It hit the floor and rolled. He stood at the glass with his phone in his hand and watched Clement go down beside pump 3. He watched Corsi key his radio. He heard the words, shots fired, suspect down, suspect was reaching for a weapon. He dialed 911. His hands were not steady. He kept his eyes on Clement, who was on the concrete, conscious, staring upward, both hands still empty. Corsi's report would be filed before the ambulance reached the lot. The word suspect would do what that word always does. It would rename a man without his knowledge and turn a shooting into a procedure and make everything that followed harder than it needed to be. What Corsi had not accounted for was the camera mounted above the canopy, angled down at pump 3, recording everything with the indifference of a machine that does not know what is at stake and does not need to. Clement was in surgery before midnight. The bullet had entered his left shoulder and missed the lung by 3 inches. The surgical team worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The outcome was not certain until it was. Adrienne Ashwell was on the highway when the call came. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her voice flat, the way a person keeps their voice flat when there is a child asleep in the back seat and no information yet that justifies waking her. Zoe was 7. She would sleep through the drive and the hospital car park and most of the corridor. Adrienne would let her. While Clement was in surgery, Corsi was at his desk. His report used the language reports always use in these situations. Failure to comply, reasonable fear for officer safety. Suspect made a sudden movement toward the weapon. Each phrase was a structural choice, not a description of what happened, but a framework for how what happened would be understood. Corsi had written reports before. He knew how the language worked. He knew that a report filed first, filed cleanly, filed in the standard vocabulary of officer safety, was a report that held. The county had 11 of his prior reports on file. Every one of them had held. He went home before 2 in the morning. Investigators arrived at the Sunoco the following day. They worked the lot methodically, starting at pump 3 and moving outward. The station's exterior camera was mounted on the canopy support above the pump, angled downward at approximately 40 degrees. The footage was clear. The investigators pulled it and watched it in the mobile unit parked at the lot's edge, without speaking. The footage showed Clement's hands from the moment the cruiser's lights came on until he hit the ground. His hands were visible the entire time. His wallet did not move, not once. The second item came from Vickers. He did not come forward immediately. He sat in his personal vehicle in the station car park for 11 minutes. The investigators noted this because the body camera footage from a passing county vehicle happened to capture his car idling before he got out and walked to the tent. He handed over his phone without being asked. The recording was 40 seconds long, shaky, vertical, shot through the glass of the station door. It was clear enough. Corsi's voice, the phrase, "you people," and Clement's raised hands at the moment the shot was fired. Vickers said he had started recording when his stomach told him to. He was not specific about what that meant. He did not need to be. The third item was Corsi's own body camera. It had been activated late 6 seconds into the contact, which was, itself, a violation of department protocol, a footnote that the investigators noted and set aside for the moment. The late activation meant the camera had not captured the contact's beginning, but it had captured the final 9 seconds before the shot. In those 9 seconds, Clement stated that he was reaching for his identification. The shot fired before the sentence was finished. The timestamp was exact. The gap between the last word Clement spoke and the sound of the discharge was 1.4 seconds. The district attorney assigned to the case reviewed all 3 sources on day 2. She watched the station footage 3 times without comment. Then she told her team to pull everything Corsi had ever filed. Every report, every complaint, every contact log going back to the beginning of his tenure. Before the trial, the question everyone in the county was asking quietly, in the way people ask questions they already suspect, the answer to was whether the shooting had been fear or something else. The answer came from the records, not from argument. In the 18 months before the night at Pump 3, Corsi had responded to 2 separate contacts involving legally armed individuals in the county. Both encounters had been logged. Both had been resolved without escalation. Neither had involved a weapon being drawn. The contact logs from both incidents recorded the individuals as white males, off-duty military reserve. No editorializing was required. The investigators placed the 3 logs side by side, the 2 prior contacts and the incident at Pump 3, and the comparison was complete. Same county. Same type of encounter, same visible holster, different outcome. The only variable that distinguished the 3rd encounter from the first 2 was documented in the demographic line of each contact report. The investigators concluded that the holster had not made Corsi afraid. It had made him certain. He had seen a legal holster before and had not fired. What had changed was not the object. What had changed was the man wearing it. If the cameras had not been rolling that night, the only record of what happened at Pump 3 would have been Corsi's report, his words, filed before the ambulance, against a man who could not respond from a surgical table. Think about that for a moment. Do you believe the outcome would have been the same? Drop yes or no in the comments. And share this if you believe the world needs to see what accountability actually looks like, because most of these stories never make it this far. The district attorney's team worked through Corsi's full history over the following 2 weeks. What they found was not a single incident. It was a pattern, documented in fragments across 9 years and 11 complaints, 3 for excessive force, 4 for racially charged conduct, the latter recorded by other officers who had noted the behavior and assumed it would be addressed through internal channels. It had not been. A supervisor's margin note from 2017 read, "Attitude issue, counseled." That was the entirety of the institutional response. There was also a civil suit filed in 2019. A black motorist had been pulled from his vehicle during a routine traffic stop, handcuffed, and held on the roadside for 38 minutes before being released without citation. The county had settled for an undisclosed amount. Corsi had returned to duty the following week. His badge had not been touched. The investigators also found a private group message shared among a small number of officers, including Corsi. There were no direct slurs. The language was careful in the way language is careful when the people using it understand the value of plausible deniability. There were jokes about cleaning up the county, references to certain kinds of drivers needing to be handled correctly, a shared image captioned, "When they act like they don't know the rules." The language did not require interpretation. It required only the willingness to read it at face value. The county had not failed to stop Jonathan Corsi. The county had renewed his contract, processed his reports, and paid the settlement that should have ended his career 6 years earlier. That night, in a hospital corridor, Adrian sat in a plastic chair with Zoe asleep across 2 seats beside her, a child's jacket folded under her daughter's head. Down the hall, the surgical team had finished. The outcome had shifted from uncertain to stable. Clement Ashwell was alive. The story was not over. It had barely started. The courtroom was full. Not loud, full. The gallery had filled before the doors were open to the public, and the people who arrived after stood along the back wall without complaint. They understood what morning this was. They had read the reports, watched the fragments of footage that had leaked before the trial, and they had come to see whether the full version of events would be allowed to exist in a room with a jury and a judge, and a man who had spent the past several months insisting it was something else. Corsi sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit. Without the uniform, without the county seal on his shoulder, he was a 52-year-old man in a suit that did not fit how he used to carry himself. He sat still. He kept his expression neutral. He watched the door. Clement Ashwell entered with a slight stiffness in his left shoulder that would not fully resolve. His physical therapy notes from the previous 8 months documented incremental improvement, a projection of 70 to 80% restored mobility, and a timeline that extended well beyond the trial date. He moved carefully. He sat straight. He did not look at Corsi. Adrian was in the second row. Zoe was at school. Adrian had made this decision weeks before the trial began, with the same clarity she had applied to every decision in the past 8 months. Her daughter would not sit in this room. Zoe did not yet know how close the night at Pump 3 had come to producing a different kind of proceeding entirely. When the prosecutor asked Clement to identify the man who had shot him, Clement turned in his chair, looked at Corsi directly for the first time, and said 2 words. The jury watched a man with nothing to prove make the most important statement in the room without raising his voice. The defense worked with what it had. It argued split-second decision-making that Corsi had encountered an armed individual at night, alone, without backup, and made a judgment call under pressure. It argued that the visible holster had constituted a legitimate source of fear, and that an officer in those circumstances could reasonably perceive a threat. It argued that Clement's deliberate, questioning responses to Corsi's commands, the requests for clarification, the references to legal rights had prolonged and complicated the encounter in ways that increased the officer's perceived risk. The defense made each of these arguments as well as they could be made. The narration at trial did not mock them. It rendered them fully, because the story did not require a weak opposition to make its point. The prosecution responded by playing the footage. Not a clip. The full 14 seconds. The station camera, angled down at Pump 3. Clement's hands, raised, open, unmoving. His wallet, stationary in his breast pocket. Corsi's approach, his right hand on his weapon, his eyes fixed on the holster from the moment he cleared the cruiser door. The final seconds of Corsi's body camera, Clement's voice stating clearly that he was reaching for identification, and the shot firing before the sentence concluded. Then the prosecution placed the 2 prior contact logs on the projected screen beside the footage. Same county, same type of encounter, same visible holster, both resolved, no weapons drawn. Both individuals, white male, off-duty military reserve. The prosecution's closing argument did not use the word racist, it used the word consistent. It asked the jury to look at what was consistent across Corsi's record, what was consistent in his behavior across a documented 9-year period, and what was consistent about the single variable that distinguished Clement Ashwell's encounter from every prior contact of the same type. The verdict came back on a Thursday morning after a day and a half of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, civil rights violations under color of law. Sentencing was 6 weeks later. Clement gave his victim impact statement standing, his left shoulder slightly forward, his voice level throughout. He did not perform grief. He reported it. He described the surgeries, 2 of them, the second unexpected and the months of limited movement, and the physical therapy that proceeded on the timeline the body chose, not the one the calendar preferred. He described what it had cost Adrian to hold the household and the family and the children's routines together through 8 months of uncertainty, with a husband who came home changed in ways that physical therapy could not address. He described Zoe's new habit of watching police vehicles as they passed on the road. And then he described the morning after the shooting, when Adrian had brought Zoe to the hospital and Zoe had stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the equipment and the bandaging and her father's face, and had asked him, in the simple, direct voice of a 7-year-old who does not yet know how to soften a question, "Daddy, did you do something wrong?" The courtroom did not move. Clement said he had not answered immediately. He described finding a way to explain to a child that a person can do every single thing correctly, every command followed, every right exercised carefully, every movement announced in advance, and still be harmed when someone with authority has already decided who they are before they speak. He said he did not know whether Zoe had fully understood. He said he knew he would have to explain it again, and probably more than once, as she got older and the world gave her more context for it. He said that part did not appear in any medical record. Then he turned to the bench and addressed the judge directly. He asked one question: how does a county sheriff have less discipline in a parking lot than a soldier has in a combat zone? The judge sentenced Jonathan Corsi to the maximum term for attempted murder, 30 years in state prison. Before the gavel, she addressed him without drama and without mercy. She said he had been trusted with authority over every person in the county. She said he had used that authority as a weapon against the people he was sworn to protect. She said the record did not ask for leniency, and she did not intend to supply it. The gavel struck. Corsi was let out through the side door. He did not look at Clement. 3 of Corsi's prior arrests were reviewed after the conviction. 1 resulted in a vacated charge. The individual had served 14 months. The Sheriff's Department announced a series of reforms: mandatory body camera activation from first contact, a transparent complaints register accessible to the public, and an independent oversight panel. Advocacy groups in the county noted that they had formally requested all 3 changes over the preceding 4 years and been told they were unnecessary. More people came forward: a mechanic from the county's east side, a retired school teacher, a postal worker, now retired, who had been stopped 14 times in 6 years and had never once received a citation. They had each filed something at some point. Each filing had moved through the same channel: reviewed, noted, closed. Vickers gave one interview 2 weeks after sentencing. He asked not to be contacted again afterward. He said he had not done anything remarkable. He said he simply had not wanted to watch something happen and do nothing. He went back to work. Clement Ashwell returned to limited duty 8 months after sentencing. He did not seek public attention. He returned to the work he had trained for, leading people, which was the thing he was built for. He also began speaking to new recruits, to community groups, to anyone who would give him an hour about the practical difference between knowing what the law says and knowing how to make it visible in a moment when it is being actively contested. Jonathan Corsi entered state prison on a Tuesday. He had spent 30 years being the final authority in every room he entered. The room he entered now had a number. The authority in it belonged to someone else. Not every stop ends at pump 3. Not every victim gets a courtroom. Not every camera is rolling, but some are. And knowing your rights, not the theoretical kind, but the kind you can state clearly in a lit lot at 10:53 on a Wednesday night when the cruiser comes in fast and the lights go on, is the first thing you bring. Because the only story that goes unchallenged is the one no one is prepared to contradict.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.